So my name's Lauri Apple. I come from Zalando, which is based in Berlin. And I'm here to talk to you about how to avoid creating GitHub junkyards. So before I get started, I want to know who in the audience is local, so lives in Vilnius or Lithuania. All right, most of you. Who is managing the GitHub organization for your company? But I mean, among you, who actually does this professionally? No, only one person. All right, interesting. Who wants to? One in the back. And how many of you work in companies where nobody at all is managing the GitHub organization? Okay, 3 in the back. All right, so one of my goals today through this talk is to help share with you some experiences and insights gathered from curating and running GitHub organizations at Zalando, so that you can help you achieve projects that are more like these beloved tools and technologies that have revolutionized our work. And to avoid this, which is a sad, that's very sensitive to volume, I want to help you avoid this kind of outcome, which is sad and depressing. So what I want to cover today is the importance of storytelling. So when we tell our stories in our GitHub organizations, we end up having narratives that serve as communication vehicles between us and our audience, which on GitHub is the whole world, potentially. Then I want to take a look at our GitHub organization at Zalando, so give you a case study of how we used to do open source and how we're doing it now. This microphone is not our friend. And then also taking that experience and helping you understand why you should clean up your GitHub organization, which might be a junkyard and it might not, but you don't want to get it to that state. And what the potential benefits are when you keep things tidy in your GitHub org. So a few statistics about Zalando. It's a really big company. Who here has never heard of it before? All right, because we don't really do business in Lithuania, so that would be one reason. So Zalando is an online fashion platform doing business in 15 countries across Europe. And here are some more statistics about our audience, our customers, our scope, the number of people that are working at the company, and then among that 13,000 employees, about 1,800 work in tech. About me, I work as an agile coach and project manager inside our core search architecture team, so the team that is running the infrastructure to support our search services. And then I'm also the open source evangelist for the company. So working across about 200 teams that are developing software and putting it on GitHub and helping them understand what to publish, what not to publish, and how to publish. And then a few other things. SRECon is a conference, site reliability engineering. We have a European installment, so if you're interested in site reliability engineering and stability of systems, come talk to me about that. A few other activities that I engage in through open source work. And these are 2 projects that I run that are relevant to open source as well. And I'll talk about the top one, feed me, readmes, later on. So this gives you an idea of Zalando's open source storefront. This is just a dashboard with some statistics. If you go to this website, you will see that we have 39 projects there. We also have a Zalando incubator where we have newer projects that are kind of developing. And there you will find some interesting new tools and components built around the Kubernetes infrastructure, which we're using Kubernetes, so we've designed some tools to help others, and they're stored for the moment in that place. So why do we open source? there are a lot of common and well-documented reasons why companies do open source generally. For one thing, just to develop software and share it with the community. We use a lot of open source software. In fact, we're primarily based around open source software, Postgres, and the different programming languages and Kubernetes. So we're run on open source contributions that others make, and so we want to give back what we can. It's also a great way to develop people, because it's not just about code. When you publish something on GitHub, there's also documentation and maintenance and reaching out to your peers in your technical community and managing contributors and users and gaining feedback. So there's a whole scope of skills and development areas that open source allows us to explore. It helps us improve the quality of our software. So when we get bug fixes and code reviews from the community, this just helps improve our work. It helps us build our reputation by being a contributor to this great ecosystem. And there also is a recruiting aspect as well. So attracting talent can happen from having open source repositories and getting feedback from projects that others find useful, and they might start to be interested in the company behind the software. So in addition to the standard reasons why we do open source, what I do is I want to ask why we have done and do open source development in the ways that we've chosen. And one of the reasons why I ask why is personal, like just the way my thinking, but also as a former journalist and storyteller, where does our open story begin? Where did it begin? Where is our story going? What stories are we telling to the world? And so a lot of that story is not done unconsciously, just through the decisions that we make and the choices that we make about what to publish and what not to publish. So when I look at our offering, I want to ask my colleagues and the organization, is the story that we're telling on GitHub coherent? So does it make sense to other software developers? Or do they look at what we've got and are completely confused about why it's public or what it does? Is the software interesting? So does it actually provide value? Is it enjoyable to use? Is there a great user experience so that people can get going with it easily, or are they going to come across a lot of obstacles before they even start to work with it? And is the software meaningful? Does it actually serve a greater purpose that the community actually wants a solution for? And finally, does the software repository itself answer the question why, about what it exists, what its purpose for existing is in public to the broader community? Does it answer, why this solution as opposed to other solutions that might be available? What makes it unique? What makes it useful? And when we ask ourselves these questions as developers or documentarians or product specialists or UX designers working in the open source landscape, we're starting to think about other people. And so that's often the secret, separating a successful project from an unsuccessful one. And when we're in this process of engaging mentally with what our peers and our communities might want or need from us, we're starting to empathize with them. And so seems to be an emerging awareness of the importance of empathy in successful software development. And some thinkers like Andrea Goulet, who I've cited here in the slide, point out that empathy is not an emotion. It's not a feeling that we have. We're being caring about people necessarily. That's a different. That is a different activity that's more related to emotions. Empathy is really a skill. And as Andrea says, it involves listening to people, understanding them, and then taking that information and applying it to respond to that person's need. Or that person's concern, or their emotions. It's intercepting the data that we're getting from other people, and then basing our actions and decisions partly on that. Chad Fowler is another person who has written great posts about empathy, and he thinks of it in terms of teamwork. When you have an empathetic team, team that's looking out for each other, or if you're a manager of a team and you're thinking empathically, then this helps you motivate the team, because suddenly you're not the boss, but you're actually part of the team. You're listening to your team, you're taking their feedback, and you're actually helping them come up with action items to improve the team, to improve the work that you are doing. And this keeps your team engaged. It also inspires them, because they suddenly feel like they're part of a bigger purpose than just sitting alone in a cubicle or at a desk and turning out code. And the interesting thing is that empathy is not something that you have to be super social and outgoing and standing on a stage in front of an audience of people to do successfully. Introverts and shy, quieter people that don't like crowds, don't really like to get into the spotlight, can be very successful at empathy. You just might choose different channels instead of being on a stage. You might write. You might manage, but not in a very boisterous way. You might, do a lot of one-on-ones with your team. So there's all different types of ways that you can empathize. But in the software world, we talk about empathy more and more, and we understand generally, a lot of people do anyway, that it's really often that critical key ingredient to success, but we sometimes put it off. And we do this in the open source world a lot. And what I've seen among my peers and others is that we can lose our story this way. One habit that I've noticed is that a lot of desire among developers to reinvent wheels or create their own spin on something that might exist already, and then keep making more software. And what happens is we start creating this big workload that's public that we can't humanly support anymore. There's just too much work that we put out to be able to really take care of it and work on all of it consistently across our personal or company portfolios. And so, but we can get a rush from doing this because it helps us feel useful a lot of times. It helps us feel important. We're creating, maybe in a high stress emergency situation, spinning up a lot of software, patching up, systems and putting this out into the internet. But what happens is that, there's so much work that we don't actually have any time then left, because we're so busy working that we don't reflect on what we're doing. So another person whose work I really like is Jeff Kothoff, who's written several books, Lean UX, Sense and Respond, and he talks about this phenomenon of being so busy, especially today in the modern era where we're working a lot. We become so busy that we don't end up having a strategy or prioritizing what to be actually working on. We just have all of it, and we just keep going. And what happens to us personally is that we burn out. And so multitasking and doing a lot of things at one time might feel like we're being useful, but in the end, it actually costs us the reflection period time to get a clearer context of what we're doing. And it also makes us stressed out, and it even makes us dumber. Daniel Levitin is a researcher and author, and he points out when we're multitasking, we often lose about 10 IQ points, because we're just so busy focused on the rapidity of the work and the speed that we don't make as good decisions as we do when we have that reflection time. And one outcome of this in the open source software world, is we don't do things like write documentation. Now, who here loves to write documentation? No one? Who here feels lukewarm about it? It's okay. All right, good. And who here absolutely hates writing documentation? Okay. Among those who hate writing documentation is because you don't feel like you're a good writer, or you just don't enjoy the process. Who just feels like they don't do it very well? Okay. And who just really hates the actual act of writing? Okay. Interesting. So, there are these personal reasons why we don't write the docs, but what often happens too is that we might write the docs because we know we should, but we just don't. And so here are some famous tech leaders from my Twitter feed where I like live in an echo chamber, I think, where everybody loves writing documentation. So, I get a little detached from this dislike for it. But, Joe Armstrong, the creator of Erlang, saying, write the docs. Victor Klang of Lightbend, replying to Kelsey Hightower of Kubernetes, like all, these people pointing out that documentation is just so incredibly essential for our ability to do our work as developers. If we hate writing documentation, there's always the opportunity to ask someone else to do it for us. But we often don't even do this. So I mentioned earlier that I have a project called Feed Me Readmes, and it's free documentation, editing, and feedback. Until about 3 weeks ago, this project I launched in February, and it had about 152 GitHub stars. About 20 people had submitted their repositories. In late October, the project went viral over Hacker News, and so now it has like 930 stars, and several people submitted some additional projects, but still, like, clearly a lot of people saw this project that was on the front page of Hacker News, and maybe 10 people submitted their projects. I know that more developers than that have repositories that might need documentation, but for whatever reason, just didn't ask for the help. When we don't have that story of documentation and the purpose around our repositories reflected in any way for our audiences to understand what we're trying to do, this creates friction for the potential user who might look at what we've put out there and they're looking for a solution. They want to see that we've actually solved their problem, and they need to understand quickly if they can use our software or not to achieve their goals. And if they can't find evidence right away that what we've presented to them will do that, they will move on. And then we lose those users and potential contributors. And then we end up with a GitHub Junkyard. So now I want to talk about how Zalando had a GitHub Junkyard and how we've started to clean it up, and I've actually made a lot of progress in that. So a little bit of history about how Zalando's technology organization had worked. For the largest time period of its existence, until 2015, it was a fairly standard tech organization with more command and control than agile. Not too much open source development, not really a particular desire to put anything on the internet for others to use. What we did put was mostly Python-based infrastructure tools, a couple of Java libraries, and but it wasn't very much at all. So in 2015, we shifted our management strategy in the tech org to hew closer to Daniel Pink's drive and these pillars of autonomy, mastery, and purpose for our tech teams. And so teams were now given autonomy to make more technical decisions. Based on their own expertise and insights and research, they could choose their own stacks. There was way more of an emphasis on agile methodologies and frameworks to get work done. A shift towards microservices and away from monolithic development, APIs, and an open source first mindset. So an encouraging message to the whole tech organization that when you start working on a new microservice or library or whatever you're working on, think about how it could be released publicly and become an open source project. And then there was this message implicit in that open source first mindset that we really wanted people to share their code. And on this, in hindsight, we maybe had been a little bit too broad. Because what happened is we published things like this on GitHub. Now this is a wrapper around AWS, platform as a service. There's slightly different interpretations of how we should frame this. But it essentially enabled us and our autonomous teams to run their own AWS accounts autonomously and also remain compliant with the auditing and privacy rules that we have to follow as a publicly traded company in Germany. So all of these tools and components do different functions that all support that goal of having autonomous teams. There's OAuth token authorization here. There's a Docker registry. So there's a lot of different things. And, we publish this as one complete set of tools. The problem is that if you don't know Zalando, and a lot of people in North America, for example, where I come from, don't, because we don't do business there. That's where the majority of major companies are kind of located, and a lot of the conversations are emerging. If they don't know Zalando, then how would they? What incentivizes them to install all of these things from a company they're not familiar with and start using it? If it's not clear to them, for example, because of the component names, which are based on private labels, fashion labels that our company sells, and if they're not sure right away what these components actually do around the names and how that's additional research and work that they have to do to understand what they're looking at. And so we really didn't think about these things at the time. It worked for us, and it continues to work for us. And a year later, after publishing this, when we surveyed the whole tech team, more than 200 people responded, that 90% of them said, keep this. This is great stuff. This works for us, but there are some issues even for us internally, like it's not human friendly. All of that stuff that we have to install and run is just a lot. The documentation, we had a lot of it, but it would be incomplete because of the rapid changes and just the scope of the landscape for this infrastructure environment. One person called it a zoo because there were just so many things that they had to think about and figure out as part of getting this project to work, and it took a while to set up. Even if your team had its own documentation spun up on how to set it up in the team's particular system, it still would. There's a lot of documentation and decision steps involved in getting that to work. We didn't survey external users because there really weren't any. I mean, there were a couple contributors and users of some of the components, but overall, we didn't really have an audience in open source context for this. So like I said, we did write docs, but there were a lot of docs. And so again, if you're looking for the solutions to your problems, the answers to your questions, and you have to wade through a lot of documentation, it just slows down your process. While we were presenting, like what I showed you, the project with all the different tools and components, and that kind of came from a particular department. The rest of the organization was also releasing their own projects and libraries and things, and they were releasing a lot. So over the course of that year, from 2015 to 2016, when I started, when someone who was me started looking at all of this stuff on GitHub, we had about 400 projects released by the end. And there was so much work that we didn't even know it was there. We couldn't, because the scope is just huge. So when I actually started doing, focusing on what was there, that was kind of a project for about 6 months, to investigate what we had on public. What I started noticing right away is that a lot of the software we were presenting wasn't usable. It was missing a strategy for someone else to use it. It was missing documentation. It was missing licenses. So people didn't know if they could use the software or not and how they could use it. We hadn't provided a licensing file in many cases. Expectations for the project. So where is it going? Where are we developing it? What is the roadmap? What are the features that we need? What kinds of contributions do we want? How do we want you to contribute? All of these components were missing, from repo to repo. Some projects had all of these missing ingredients, as well as proof of code coverage and other trust-building elements to get users to actually try the projects out. But a lot of things just didn't. And a lot of projects were also very tightly coupled to our systems, so no one even could use them. We had guidelines. So not long after that shift in strategy towards a more autonomy, mastery, and purpose model, a group of us got together and formed an open source guild. So this was an informal collection of technologists that cared about open source, and we created a set of guidelines to help guide our peers to develop software and get involved in open source development. But the issue was that it was sort of selective in how we applied them. So maybe one team would have very rigorous standards and apply them to the letter. Other teams might just pick the favorite guideline, which often was the case, like share all of your code, and then disregard or minimize the importance of the other guidelines. So this resulted in inconsistent quality levels and a very incoherent story for our open source offering as a whole. To try to minimize the impact of this publicly, we created a separate GitHub organization called the Incubator, but we kind of used this incubator as more of a graveyard or a place to just put a lot of the code that we wanted to share. And so we wanted to, there was this really nice and strong and noble belief to share the code. This mindset was very prevalent in the organization. So this incubator allowed people to share their code without crowding out the actual self-contained projects that we were also offering. But this desire to share a lot of code really was the driving force behind 400 repositories by the end of a year. So we really loved to publish, but we hated to delete what we published. And there are different reasons for this. So sometimes spinning something up really quickly because we don't want to miss out on this perceived lost opportunity to get there first. A new technology comes up and we just want to have some sort of presence that we're using this particular technology, and so we might spin up something right away, and then we don't miss out anymore. But do we maintain the project after we publish it? The belief that the code is the documentation itself, that's just enough for people, and here you go. But as it turned out, that wasn't enough for users because they didn't use it. Quantity, like look how much stuff we have, we're publishing all the time, but not as much focus on the quality. And why did we do these? Why did we make these choices? Well, again, it goes back to the busyness factor. A lot of our teams were spinning up, brand new systems really quickly. The platform with all the tools and components was done in a very short period of time to address a critical need. And so there wasn't much time to pause, reflect, and really plan things out. The context and the habits that we had as a team affected how we developed. And even a lack of confidence, I think, because if we don't go all the way with a project, we never can then say that we actually failed. We might not know if we have failed or not because, we didn't have the contributor file, we didn't have a licensing file, so, we don't know. We can't say that we failed yet. It's a mystery. And so then we don't have to confront certain feelings that might feel uncomfortable. Now, we didn't plan our junkyard, of course. We created it, but it wasn't mindful. We just ended up with it at the end of a year. And what if we had done a few things differently? Like, what if we had focused on the why behind every published repository? What if we had focused on engaging the community from the beginning? Always creating software that they could use that were not specific to our needs. What if we had been pruning and deleting things regularly in our organization to make the self-contained projects quick and easy to find? What if we had these dialogues and empathized with our potential users and contributors by telling them how to contribute to our work? We weren't consistently doing those things. But, this was not a whole fail. There was actually a lot of great work embedded within all of this stuff. Like I said, the network of tools and components that was named after the fashion labels, still works. It still runs for us. It helped us solve really complex problems. So there were treasures lurking within. So now I want to get to the part where how we uncovered these treasures and how you might as well if you face the need to. So I mentioned that this was January of 2016, I started looking at what we'd actually published, and it took about 6 months to go through everything. And the purpose for this was to really find those treasures, find the repositories that had external users and contributors, that had all of the essential files for a user and contributor to understand what they were looking at and use it. Understand, what was tested, what had good documentation. Documentation, for me, as a former writer and editor, that was like, if that's the biggest obstacle in the way of somebody using this effectively, like that was a pretty quick win. So, really understanding what our habits and patterns were in open source development. And along the way, educating my colleagues about, the decisions that they were making, like having conversations with them, often one by one, sometimes with teams, like, okay, like you put this out on the internet. Why? What's your goal? And if they weren't aware of it because, they just thought the code was enough, like helping them to consider what else they might be able to achieve with their work and their ideas. And meanwhile, helping them to understand why a license file is important, why a good documentation is important, helping them kind of explore the potential of their efforts in a bigger scale so that they could build communities around the work that they were putting out. Taking the guidelines that we established, we actually, earlier this year, made them more official. So one way, after this big dig and kind of excavating the treasures, we had a lot less open source development that we were presenting to the public in a more like in a more visible way. It was from 400 repos, it was way fewer than that, several dozen. In the meantime, we actually took our guidelines, which were quite good because they was collaboratively developed and informed by the industry best practices, and we just made them official into a strategy. And so that took place in May of this year. And the strategy is sort of the single point of truth for everyone. We all have to follow it, and there's no exceptions. We're flexible about things, but we must have these basic ingredients in every repository that we publish. In part of this process, we've created checks and reviews for projects among the team. So it's not a top-down approach, but it's really trying to crowdsource quality and feedback and making these guidelines, stick, but because of the decisions that we make and not because people told us that these are important and now we have to follow them. So when you have a no exceptions policy, you're treating everyone in your team fairly, and that's really the goal. Not to grant exceptions for some people to push everything public because they've been at the company the longest or they're the most influential, and then not allow others, like they have to comply by rules. No, like everyone has to follow the standards. And when we have a document to look at, it just removes a lot of the political noise around the decisions that we make about publishing. It also changes the culture because it brings more objectivity to our publication process. We have the whole team, all 1,800 technologists can weigh in at any time on projects in an internal mailing list or on HipChat. We're in Germany, so we can't use Slack because of privacy and data reasons, so we use HipChat. So you can question what you're seeing in HipChat, like it's very open in that sense. We also have a review group, smaller and selected representatives of not just technology, but legal and compliance, security, to also help us shape this policy and help the policy mean maximally to the organization what it can. Looking at licensing very in depth and making sure we have a very effective but also clear and democratic licensing policy for teams, making sure that we provide the right language to insert in licensing files for teams. So that all comes from the review group now. And then leadership has endorsed this policy, so it had executive buy-in. And then, the challenge in many organizations of our size is really getting the middle to also be aware of the policy and make it live day to day in their teams. So we have our how-to guidelines that are now sort of codified as a strategy. As part of this, we also just created a very simple set of rules of play, because you don't want to really read like 10 pages of a policy to find out if you can put something on GitHub or not. So we have a set of rules of play that really simplify the language, and it basically acts as a Google form. If I want to publish something on GitHub, I do this form. It's 17 questions, but most of them are yes, no. Like, so it's really simple. Do you have this file? Yes. Yes, I have the security requirements covered. And then you just submit it to the review group. We take a look at it. If there's something missing or the project's not up to the quality that we're looking for, we work with the authors to help them get it to that level. And then we publish. So this has been really effective, and it's very much like what other companies do of our size to ensure that before we release something, it's as high a quality as it can be. Companies like Google automate a lot of this work. We are now at that place where we are looking at using automation tools with the hope that we can actually develop customized tools at some point. Again, this is the checklist that I mentioned. If anybody wants to see this after the talk, by the way, I'm happy to show it to you. If everything goes well and the authors complete the checklist, the review group gives a sign-off and goes to the, GitHub. And we put it in our incubator organization, where it has about 6 months to develop. So the authors of a project have 6 months to promote the work, get users, contributors, get feedback from internal teams. And, this is a lot of time for us to see if a project actually has what it takes to become useful to the community. So our incubator organization is no longer this kind of like sad junkyard, graveyard place where dead projects live. It actually is an incubator for the future. It's hopeful. When we continue having, educating our teams and thinking about GitHub organizations as steps towards, success. So the best projects you'll find that we have with the most users and contributors and history and feedback from community you'll find in our main GitHub organization. And then the incubator, like I mentioned, is the testing ground. And then now, instead of putting code on the internet, because of putting code on the internet, the end purposes, we really just encourage teams to use GitHub Enterprise and do InnerSource, which is the open source collaboration model, but inside an organization. So, ideally, a team or an author will spin something up, use GitHub Enterprise to build a community internally, get feedback internally, get users and other teams and departments internally. And then once they've proven the success of their work internally, then they have a pretty good case that they might see similar success externally. We're not there yet consistently, but we're getting there as a process of development. If you're curious about what our guidelines look like, this repository at the bottom is where you can find the original. It's a more detailed and modified draft of our original how-to, but this has helped other organizations that are building open source strategies for the first time and need a model to follow. So you might find that useful. I'm not sure what's going on with this slide, but once you put something live and you have the ingredients for others to use your work, you can actually do user research. And this brings back that question of empathy, do my users and potential contributors actually find value in my work? So ask them. Ask them in feedback surveys, ask them in one-on-ones, ask them for interviews, and you can then gather data to see, what kind of improvements you need to make, what features you need to add, how do you make your work better? And this will prevent your projects from dying, because you're bringing new life and new opportunity into them. When you do this, really envision your actual users. So this is a sample user persona based on this cat. And if you can make software that's appealing to cats, then you're really succeeding. That's really impressive. But this is a cat user, as a back-end developer, needs things to work quickly and reliably. So, the challenge if you're making software for this person cat is, serving those needs. So asking this people who are like this user, what do you think about what I'm trying to make? What do you think about what I've already made? Does it work for you? Does it solve your problems? Can you please interact with it? And I will take data about how you get this thing up and running and install it. And, do you pause when it's not clear that, the next step, do I need to improve my documentation? Hi. It's okay. So this will help you, like I said, keep your projects alive and growing and going. Write your documentation, this is your first step. This is how people come to find your projects. If you don't have anything there, or if you have no install instructions, they're going to have to figure out how to get this thing you've made to work. And why should they bother? Why should they take that time? How have you promised that they can trust you that you've offered a solution to their problem? They don't have any evidence for that. So provide the evidence and provide the contributing file so that people can contribute and know what to do. Provide contact information so they can contact you, a maintainers file with your email address. Provide a license so they know how they can use your project. Do all of these things, and your chances of getting an audience increase. It's not guaranteed, but it's more likely. And the likelihood that your project will survive also increases. Teaching these kinds of habits takes time, especially if you're in a big organization or you're leading a team. These are habits, and habits don't change overnight usually. Guidelines, templates for the checklist for filling out the essential ingredients of a project, setting up new GitHub organizations. These are all really simple, quick wins that you can do to better manage your GitHub output. What's slower is changing the mindset of your team, because first of all, they have to know why. Why is the old way not as effective as what you're offering? And if you can't, convince people, then it's going to take a lot longer for them to get to where you are. You have to have trust among your teams to help them change. You have to, think bigger. Hey, your small library could actually be a big, successful library just by doing a couple of these things. If a person who makes a library doesn't see that possibility, then it's going to just take a lot longer for them to really feel engaged and inspired to do those small things to then set themselves up better for success. If you're looking for an agnostic, more industry set of policy guidelines and suggestions, I highly recommend that you go to the To-Do group, which is a consortium of Facebook, Google, Etsy, Box, a lot of the leading companies in the industry. They're all part of the To-Do group, and they have, it's part of the Linux Foundation, so they've just recently released a lot of very useful, detailed guides that you can read about everything from setting up an open source program office to how to handle compliance issues, how to deal with intellectual property questions, how to participate in communities. There's tons of very useful stuff there from leaders in the industry that have helped put that together. In closing, this kind of work about building changing habits and mindsets is hard, but it's also really enjoyable, because when you see somebody who doesn't really think that what they're doing is important or significant or interesting, and then by just doing a couple things differently and helping them along in that process, and then they end up succeeding way beyond their expectations, that is really fun. It's really fun to help people in that way. And so in my wanderings in the open source community, not just in Zalando, but now more generally and broadly in bigger projects that we all know and love, there is an awareness that we need to be doing a lot more of these empathy-based actions for our projects to succeed. We need to write documentation, as all of those folks on Twitter said. We need to talk to each other. We need to think about our users. We need to build software that is clear to easy to understand and has a good user experience. So recently I'm floating around this concept and starting to talk to people about this concept of teaminess as a service, which basically means that your team isn't just your own development team, the people that you work with. In the open source context, the team can be potentially the whole internet. Any sort of contributors or users that cross paths with your work and get involved can be seen as your team members. So you're not maybe as responsible for helping them as you might with your colleagues, but still it might be worth your time and effort to think of them at the same level, because you don't know what value and help and insights and opportunities they might present to you. Build a friendship with them, build a relationship with them, and you might be really pleasantly surprised. So with that, I am done. And I have some questions. 3 minutes. Or no, I guess it's 8 minutes, 12:55. Oh, yeah. Did you use any tools to enforce the policies, or was it purely by hand? It was by hand. So we have one relevant piece of tooling that we made. It's a GitHub integration called Zapper. And it is a tool that helps teams ensure that we adhere to the 4 Eyes principle, which is required of us by our auditors as a publicly traded company. So Zapper works like when I make a pull request, 2 other people give me a thumbs up, and then I can merge. So that's a requirement for all repositories, including ones in GitHub Enterprise, that we have teams install Zapper, and they also have to make the repositories open. Like in GitHub Enterprise, you can't really have private repositories because they need to be adhering to the auditor requirements. And so that's automated a bit, but in terms of checking for licenses and things like that, we are not automated yet. I guess that's it. It's the only one I have.